The unseen arrival. The planet Earth had been quiet for a long time. It was a world that most galactic civilizations thought they knew well. The reports were always the same. The humans were primitive, their technology crude, and their ability to defend themselves laughable. To most alien hunters, Earth was just another easy target, another simple mission in their vast hunting experiences. But for the hunters who had arrived that day, something was about to change. The small spacecraft descended into the forest at the edge of Earth's wilderness. Its sleek silver body reflected the fading sunlight as it cut through the sky, leaving only the slightest trace behind. Inside, a team of alien hunters prepared for what they believed would be a routine job. Their leader, Zarkin, was the first to speak. "Stay alert. This isn't like our usual hunts," he said, his voice deep and calm. He was a seasoned hunter, known across the galaxy for his skill and cunning. The other hunters nodded, their eyes scanning the dense trees below. They were here for one purpose: to track down and capture the deadliest creature to have ever walked Earth, a creature the humans called the Deathworlder. The Deathworlder had been spotted on Earth several times in the past, but it was always elusive, always out of reach. It had left many hunters baffled and afraid. Zarkin had heard the stories. Some said it was just a myth, an exaggerated tale spun by Earth's primitive inhabitants. Others said it was a monstrous being that had somehow survived on a planet meant for weak, fragile species. Zarkin didn't believe in myths. He trusted only what he could see and hunt. And today, he was going to prove that the Deathworlder was just another prey, waiting to be captured. The ship gently landed in the thick forest, the leaves and branches shaking as the heavy metal craft made contact with the ground. The door hissed open, revealing a dense fog that blanketed the ground below. The air smelled of damp earth and unfamiliar scents. For a moment, the team stood still, listening to the silence. There were no signs of life, no sounds of animals, no movement. It was as if the entire world had gone quiet, waiting. Zarkin stepped off the ship first, his sharp eyes scanning the area. The others followed, their weapons at the ready. They had been trained for every scenario. Nothing could catch them off guard, or so they thought. "Spread out," Zarkin ordered. "Look for tracks. Look for anything unusual." The hunters moved cautiously, their steps light as they ventured deeper into the fog. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches reaching high into the sky, blocking out most of the sunlight. The further they went, the thicker the fog became, and the less they could see. It was a maze, a perfect environment for a predator to hide. But there was something strange. As they walked, the hunters noticed that the usual sounds of wildlife were missing. No chirping birds, no rustling animals, no insects buzzing. It was eerily quiet. "I don't like this," murmured one of the younger hunters, Kale. "It's too quiet." Zarkin didn't respond at first. He had learned to trust his instincts, and something about this planet didn't sit right with him. But he kept his thoughts to himself. There would be time for questions later. They had a mission to complete. Then, out of nowhere, a sudden noise broke the silence. The sound of something moving in the fog, just beyond their sight. The hunters froze, their bodies tensing, hands tightening around their weapons. Zarkin motioned for them to stay still. He had heard it too. It was a rustling sound, something large moving through the trees. But it was far away, too far to be anything immediate. Still, the hairs on the back of Zarkin's neck stood on end. "Stay sharp," Zarkin whispered. They continued forward, slower now, each of them scanning the mist-filled forest for signs of movement. Zarkin's eyes darted from tree to tree, watching for any flicker of motion. He knew that whatever was out there, it was aware of them. But it didn't attack. Not yet. Suddenly, one of the hunters, Lyra, spoke up. "Look!" she shouted, pointing toward a patch of ground where strange footprints had appeared. They were huge, too big to belong to any creature the hunters had encountered before. The prints were deep in the soil, as if something incredibly heavy had stepped there. Zarkin bent down to examine them closely, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. "They're fresh," he said grimly. "We're not alone." He stood up, his gaze scanning the trees around them. The fog seemed to close in tighter, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "What are we dealing with here?" Kel whispered, his voice barely audible. "This doesn't feel right." Before anyone could respond, another noise broke the silence. This time, it was closer, a branch snapping in the distance, followed by the sound of something large moving swiftly through the trees. The hunters immediately raised their weapons, but they still saw nothing. Zarkin's instincts screamed at him to get out of the open. Without a word, he motioned for the team to take cover behind the thick trees, and they quickly complied. The sound of movement grew louder, and for the first time since they had arrived, Zarkin felt the weight of uncertainty press on him. He had hunted across countless planets, but this was different. And then, from the thick fog ahead of them, a shape appeared. It was massive, a shadow moving through the mist, its form not fully visible but undeniably present. The hunters could feel its presence, an overwhelming, almost suffocating power. Zarkin's heart raced. They had just entered the territory of something they didn't understand. And the worst part was, it was watching them. "Stay ready," Zarkin ordered, his voice steady, though his own fear crept up. "We've got a long night ahead." As the shape in the fog drew closer, the hunters realized they were no longer the ones in control. They had just stepped into the Deathworlder's game. And the Deathworlder was playing for keeps. The first encounter. The hunters had taken cover behind the towering trees, their eyes never leaving the shadowy shape moving through the mist. The thick fog seemed to bend and swirl around it, making it nearly impossible to make out any clear details. But they could all feel it, a presence that was both terrifying and captivating. Zarkin's grip tightened on his weapon. The alien hunters were no strangers to danger, but this was unlike anything they had encountered before. The creature they were after was no mere animal. It was something far more cunning, far more intelligent. The silence between them grew thicker, almost suffocating, as they waited for the next move. Then, as if sensing their presence, the shadow in the fog stopped moving. For a moment, there was complete stillness. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath, and the hunters could feel the weight of its gaze. It was as though the Deathworlder was watching them, studying them, deciding whether or not they were worth the trouble. Zarkin motioned for his team to remain perfectly still. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but he knew they couldn't. They were already too deep into the hunt. And then, with a sudden rustle of movement, it appeared. Out of the mist, a massive form emerged, its outline growing clearer by the second. The creature was unlike anything the hunters had imagined. Its massive frame was covered in a thick, leathery hide, dark brown and almost black, which blended seamlessly with the fog around it. Its eyes gleamed like twin orbs of fire, glowing with an intelligence that was terrifying to witness. The creature stood on two legs, its body towering over the hunters, easily twice their size. Its claws were razor-sharp, gleaming in the dim light filtering through the trees. For a moment, the hunters stood frozen. No one dared to move or speak. It was too much to comprehend. The Deathworlder had been a myth to them, something spoken of in hushed tones, but now it stood before them, undeniably real. Zarkin's heart raced. This wasn't a simple hunt. This was something far more dangerous. The creature, however, didn't immediately attack. Instead, it seemed to be studying them in return, as if savoring the moment. The silence stretched on, and the hunters felt their nerves fray. What was it waiting for? Why wasn't it charging? Finally, the Deathworlder did something that no one had expected. It grinned. The smile wasn't like anything a human, or any alien, might ever make. It was wide, savage, and filled with an unsettling sense of playfulness. The creature crouched low to the ground, its muscles rippling as it moved with incredible agility, almost as if it were preparing to spring into action. But it didn't attack. Instead, it took a few steps forward, each one slow and deliberate, its eyes never leaving the hunters. The hunters felt a chill run down their spines. This wasn't just a creature defending its territory. It was enjoying the fear it was instilling in them. "Get ready," Zarkon whispered, his voice trained but firm. "It's not going to let us just leave." One of the younger hunters, Kale, tried to steady his breathing, his hand gripping his weapon tightly. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke. "What's it doing? Why isn't it attacking?" Zarkon didn't have an answer. He had seen predators before, but this was something different. The way the Deathworlder moved, the way it seemed to almost mock them. It was unlike any creature he had ever hunted. The creature's grin widened as it moved closer, each step purposeful. The hunters instinctively stepped back, but the creature didn't stop. It circled them slowly, almost as if playing with its prey. Zarkon's pulse quickened. He had always been in control during hunts, but this time he felt the control slipping through his fingers. The Deathworlder stopped for a moment, its eyes narrowing as it observed them. And then it did something shocking. It let out a deep, guttural laugh, an eerie, bone-chilling sound that echoed through the trees, sending a shiver through the hunters. Kale couldn't hold back any longer. His voice broke the silence. "What is this thing? Why is it laughing?" Zarkon held up a hand, silencing him. The laughter had stopped, and the Deathworlder stood still again, its gaze still locked on them. Its grin remained, though its eyes had narrowed to dangerous slits. The creature wasn't afraid of them. It wasn't even worried about their weapons. It was waiting, playing with them. Suddenly, without warning, the Deathworlder lunged forward. The movement was so fast, so sudden, that the hunters barely had time to react. One of them, Lyra, screamed as the creature closed in on her, its claws slashing through the air. The hunter's weapon misfired, and the creature's grin only widened as it effortlessly dodged the blast. In a blink, it was on top of Lyra, its massive form pinning her to the ground with incredible strength. The other hunters froze, watching in horror as the creature played with its prey, pinning Lyra down as if she were nothing more than a toy. But it wasn't killing her, yet. Instead, it lifted her up with a single hand, holding her above the ground, as if showing the others its power. Zarkon's mind raced. This wasn't an ordinary predator. It didn't kill quickly. It toyed with its prey, savoring the moment. And now, it was testing them. "Don't just stand there," Zarkon barked, snapping the hunters out of their shock. "Get her back. Now." But before they could react, the Deathworlder released Lyra, dropping her to the ground, as if she were nothing more than a ragdoll. The creature took a step back, grinning once more as it surveyed the group. Its eyes gleamed with excitement. It was enjoying this. It wasn't hunting. It was playing. And that terrified the hunters more than anything. The hunt begins. The forest seemed to close in around them, thick with tension. The Deathworlder's savage grin remained, a reminder that they were not in control. It had toyed with them, toyed with Lyra, and now it was making a game of their lives. Lyra scrambled to her feet, eyes wide with panic, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She had never been this close to death, not like this. And now she was trembling, not just from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that she was nothing more than a plaything to the creature. Zarkon's mind raced. He knew he had to take control, but the situation had turned from a simple hunt into a nightmare. The Deathworlder wasn't interested in killing them. It was more interested in drawing this out, in making them suffer. "Stay calm," Zarkon ordered, his voice steady, though his own heart pounded. He scanned the surroundings. They needed to regain the advantage. "Fast. Form a circle. Stay close, and watch each other's backs." The hunters quickly followed his command, their weapons aimed outward, scanning for any sign of the Deathworlder's next move. But the creature was too fast, too unpredictable. It darted around the edges of their circle, its eyes gleaming with amusement. It wasn't attacking. Not yet. Kale, one of the youngest hunters, was visibly shaking. His weapon quivered in his hands. "What is this thing?" he whispered. "It's playing with us. It could have killed us all already." Zarkan's jaw clenched. "It's not done yet. It's testing us. But we can't let it break us. Hold your ground." Just as he finished speaking, the Deathworlder let out another unsettling laugh. The sound echoed around the forest, bouncing off the trees and getting louder, more taunting. It was like the creature was daring them to make a move, daring them to challenge it. Zarkan's instincts screamed at him to strike first, but he knew it would only lead to more chaos. This was a predator unlike any other. It wasn't a wild animal. It was something intelligent, something with a capacity to think and plan. They had no idea what it was capable of. And then, as if it had finally grown bored with their standoff, the Deathworlder made its move. It darted forward with blinding speed, faster than anything Zarkan had ever seen. Its claws swiped through the air like a blur, aiming for one of the hunters. Kale, the one who had been trembling. Zarkan barely had time to react as the young hunter fired off a shot, but it missed. The Deathworlder was too quick, ducking under the blast and closing the distance between them in a split second. Kale let out a cry of terror, but the creature's claws didn't make contact. Instead, it sidestepped at the last moment, grabbing Kale by the arm and effortlessly flipping him into the air before tossing him aside like a ragdoll. Kale crashed into the ground with a painful thud, his weapon flying out of his hand. The other hunters flinched, but they didn't hesitate. They rushed forward to aid their fallen comrade. But as they moved, the Deathworlder was already circling again, ready to strike. It had taken only moments for it to reduce their carefully planned defense to chaos. Zarkan's eyes narrowed. This was no longer a hunt. It was a challenge, one the Deathworlder was winning. They had to turn the tide before it was too late. "Fall back," Zarkan barked. "We need to regroup." The hunters began to move in sync, retreating in an organized fashion, their eyes never leaving the creature. But it wasn't chasing them. It was waiting, letting them pull back, as though savoring their every move. Zarkan didn't understand. Why wasn't it attacking again? Why had it only toyed with them? There was something about the creature's behavior that made Zarkan uneasy. It wasn't the brute force of a typical predator. No, this Deathworlder was something else entirely. It was a calculating hunter, one that understood its prey, and knew exactly how to make them feel powerless. Suddenly, as if to emphasize this point, the Deathworlder stood on its hind legs, towering over the hunters, its eyes glinting with malicious joy. It wasn't making a move to kill them. Instead, it let out another laugh, louder and more mocking than the last one. "You think you can beat me?" the Deathworlder seemed to say, its voice low and guttural, though no words were spoken. It was the kind of laugh that made Zarkan's blood run cold. The creature wasn't worried about dying. It didn't fear death. It was the one in control. Kale struggled to his feet, pain evident in his expression. His legs were unsteady, but he was determined. "We can't just let it keep playing with us," he gasped. "We have to strike. Now." Zarkan's eyes met Kale's, a spark of understanding passing between them. This wasn't about defeating the creature in a traditional sense. They needed to outsmart it, bait it into making a mistake. "Get to the ship," Zarkan said quietly, motioning for the hunters to follow. "We'll lure it there. If it wants a game, let's make it a game it won't win." The hunters nodded, and together they moved as one, heading back toward the ship. They couldn't let the Deathworlder control the fight any longer. They had to turn its twisted game back on itself. But the Deathworlder was watching them closely, and Zarkan could feel its eyes on them, the pressure mounting. It knew what they were doing. It knew they were trying to escape, but it wasn't going to let them. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet trembled. A roar split the air. The Deathworlder had made its decision. It was coming. And this time, It wasn't playing. The chase. The ground shook with each step the Deathworlder took, its massive form moving through the dense forest with terrifying speed. Zarkin's heart pounded in his chest as he urged the hunters forward. The ship was close, just beyond the ridge. If they could reach it, they could regroup, resupply, and maybe, just maybe, turn the tide. But the creature wasn't going to let them go so easily. Its monstrous roar filled the air, sending birds scattering into the sky, and they could feel the vibrations beneath their feet as it sprinted after them. "They're not going to make it," Kale yelled, his voice high with fear, but Zarkin shot him a look that silenced him. "Keep moving. Don't stop," Zarkin commanded, his eyes scanning their surroundings. The thick trees provided some cover, but it wouldn't be enough to outrun the creature. They had no idea what it was capable of, but they knew one thing for sure. It was fast, and it wasn't just hunting them anymore. It was making this into its personal sport. Kale, now more focused than ever, pushed through the pain in his body. His arm throbbed where the creature had tossed him like a rag doll, but adrenaline was surging through him now, forcing him forward. He didn't dare look back, though the sounds of the creature's pursuit were impossible to ignore. Zarkin led the way, pushing through the underbrush. Almost there, he muttered to himself, though he wasn't sure if he was convincing the others or himself. He knew the terrain well. The ridge would give them a better vantage point. From there, they could hopefully launch a counterattack, or at least find a place to fortify. Behind them, the Deathworlder's laugh echoed again, cruel and triumphant. It was almost mocking them now. Zarkin could hear its heavy footsteps getting closer, and his instincts screamed at him to hurry. The creature wasn't just toying with them. It was hurting them, pushing them towards a trap. And then it happened. The ground under their feet trembled harder than before. A loud crash sounded behind them, followed by a blur of movement. The Deathworlder had leaped over a large tree, landing right in front of them, cutting off their escape. The massive form of the creature blocked their path, its claws gleaming in the moonlight. "Stop!" Zarkin shouted, raising his hand. The hunters skidded to a halt, barely managing to avoid colliding with each other. The Deathworlder stood there, towering over them, its grin wide and feral. It didn't need to say anything. Its eyes told them everything they needed to know. There was no escape. It had them exactly where it wanted them. Zarkin felt a cold sweat trickle down his spine. This wasn't a fight. It was a game, and they were the prey. It had captured them with ease, and now it was enjoying the chase. But this was where it all changed. Zarkin couldn't let it win. Not like this. "Don't back down," he yelled, though he knew his words weren't for the creature. They were for his team, for Kale and the others who were still struggling to keep their composure. The Deathworlder cocked its head, as if it were amused by Zarkin's defiance. Then it crouched low to the ground, almost like a predator preparing to pounce. The hunters quickly fell into formation around it, their weapons aimed at the creature. Zarkin took a step forward, trying to project confidence, though his mind raced for a plan. "Hold steady," Zarkin said, his voice steady but low. The hunters didn't flinch, but the tension in the air was palpable. The creature was faster than them, stronger than them, but it was toying with them. They just had to make it stop. The Deathworlder's grin widened. With a sudden move, it lunged forward, faster than Zarkin could react. Kale fired first, but the shot missed as the creature dove to the side, dodging the blast with the ease of a seasoned hunter. The Deathworlder was playing with them again, its movements fluid and effortless. It was a terrifying sight, one of unmatched skill and power. It moved like liquid shadow, its large form shifting through the underbrush in a blur, and before Zarkin knew what was happening, the creature had vanished. "Where did it go?" Kale asked, looking around frantically. Zarkin's eyes scanned the area. The fog had rolled in again, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The Deathworlder was hiding, waiting for the next move. It wasn't done playing. It was studying them, looking for the perfect moment to strike. "Stay alert," Zarkin said, his voice tense. "It's not done with us yet." The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. The hunters were on edge, eyes darting to every movement in the trees, every shadow that seemed to shift. They could feel it, the weight of the creature's presence lingering just beyond the edge of their vision. And then, without warning, it struck again. The Deathworlder burst from the shadows with a bone-shaking roar, its claws slashing through the air. One of the hunters, Lyra, barely managed to dodge the blow, but it grazed her arm, sending a spray of blood into the air. She cried out in pain, but quickly raised her weapon again, aiming for the creature's head. The Deathworlder wasn't fazed. It seemed to enjoy the chaos, its laughter filling the air as it swiped at the hunters once more. They scattered, trying to avoid the deadly claws, but the creature's movements were so fluid, so fast, that it was impossible to predict. Zarkin's mind was racing now, trying to think of a way to turn the tables. They couldn't keep running. The Deathworlder was too fast, too relentless. They needed to do something drastic, something to catch it off guard. As if reading his thoughts, Kale suddenly shouted, "We need to fight back. We can't just keep running." Zarkin looked at him and nodded. "I know, but we can't just rush in. We need to lure it, get it in the open, where we can trap it." The plan was risky. If it failed, they'd be done for. But they had no choice. They had to outsmart the creature, use its overconfidence against it. Zarkin motioned for Kale and the others to follow him, and together they moved deeper into the forest, hoping the Deathworlder would take the bait. But with every step they took, the sense of impending doom grew heavier. The game had begun, but who would be the one to win? The trap is set. The darkness of the forest was thick now, the moonlight barely breaking through the canopy. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and every rustle of leaves sent a chill down the spine. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of damp earth and the faint metallic tang of blood. The group of hunters moved with caution, each step deliberate as they advanced toward the clearing ahead. "We're close," Zarkin whispered to his team, his voice barely audible over the distant sounds of the forest. "Get into position. On my mark, we move." Kale, Lyra, and the others nodded, their faces tight with tension. They were ready. The pain from their earlier encounters still lingered, but they had no choice. The Deathworlder had made it clear that it wasn't just hunting them, it was enjoying their fear. And if they were to survive this nightmare, they would have to fight back, not just with their weapons, but with their minds. Zarkin led them deeper into the woods, guiding them toward a narrow pass, a natural choke point where the terrain would limit the Deathworlder's movement. If they could force it into that area, they might be able to trap it. But it had to be perfect. One mistake, and they would be caught in the open. They reached the pass, a narrow space between two towering rocks, the trees behind them thinning out into the clearing. Zarkin signaled for everyone to halt. They took their places quickly, hiding in the brush and behind rocks. Every hunter knew their role. Kale and Lyra would be the decoys, drawing the creature's attention, while the others would remain in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Zarkin took a deep breath. He could hear it now, the faint rustling in the trees, the soft thud of massive feet moving through the forest. The Deathworlder was out there, stalking them, just waiting for the right moment to pounce. And then, the laugh. It echoed through the trees, chilling Zarkin to the core. The creature was close. It was enjoying this. It had no fear. It knew it could take them all down with ease. But they weren't afraid anymore. They were determined. "On my mark," Zarkin murmured. His hand tightened around the grip of his weapon. The silence stretched. Seconds felt like minutes. And then, finally, the Deathworlder emerged from the shadows. It was enormous, its fur matted with blood from the earlier skirmishes. Its eyes glowed with a malicious intelligence, scanning the forest, searching for its prey. It looked so sure of itself, so confident in its power that it didn't even notice the trap closing around it. "Now," Zarkin shouted, and the hunters sprang into action. Kale and Lyra moved first, darting into the clearing and drawing the creature's attention. The Deathworlder's eyes locked onto them immediately, and with a swift, terrifying movement, it charged toward them, claws outstretched. Kale barely managed to fire a shot, but the creature dodged with ease, its speed defying logic. Lyra let out a shriek, and the Deathworlder grinned as it pursued her, but it was too late. The rest of the hunters sprang from their hiding spots, flanking the creature, firing in unison. Zarkin aimed for the Deathworlder's legs, knowing that if they could disable its mobility, they might have a chance. The creature roared in fury, swiping at the air, but the shots were hitting. It was slowing down, its once graceful movements now hampered by the injuries. Blood poured from its side, staining the ground. But it didn't stop. Instead, it seemed to grow more enraged. Kale ran to one side, firing again, trying to keep the creature distracted. Lyra moved to the other side, using her agility to stay just out of reach of the Deathworlder's claws. But the creature wasn't just a mindless beast, it was thinking. Its head snapped back toward Zarkin and the others, its eyes narrowing with deadly focus. It was learning, adapting. Zarkin cursed under his breath. This wasn't enough. They needed to hit it harder, faster. Kale, Lyra, get back to the rocks now, Zarkin ordered. They had to pull the Deathworlder deeper into the trap, and the only way to do that was to bait it further. The two hunters hesitated for a moment, but then they obeyed, retreating toward the narrow pass. The Deathworlder growled, its patience wearing thin. With one final monstrous roar, it charged after them, a blur of claws and fury. "Now," Zarkin shouted again, and the hunters moved quickly, closing in from all sides. The Deathworlder was nearly in the pass now, its large frame squeezing between the rocks. Its powerful body seemed almost too big for the space, but it didn't hesitate. It pushed forward, thinking it had cornered its prey. But that's when it happened. Zarkin, with the help of his team, triggered the trap. Hidden ropes, wires, and makeshift barriers suddenly sprang to life. The creature's legs were caught by snares, and a net of thick, electrified material fell from the trees above, ensnaring it completely. The Deathworlder struggled, its roar filled with rage, but it was trapped. Its massive limbs thrashed against the restraints, but the more it fought, the tighter the net became. Its eyes were wide with fury and disbelief. The hunters didn't stop. They continued to fire, aiming for the creature's most vulnerable spots. Its eyes, its underbelly, its legs. Each shot seemed to slow it down, weaken it. The creature's once invincible movements became sluggish, and the defiance in its eyes began to fade as the weight of its injuries took their toll. It roared one last time, its body shaking with the effort, but it was no longer the unstoppable force it once was. It was a creature on the verge of collapse. Zarkin stood there, his breath heavy, his weapon still aimed at the creature. For a moment, no one moved. The forest was silent, save for the creature's labored breaths. "We did it," Kale said, his voice hoarse. But Zarkin didn't lower his weapon. "Not yet. We're not done yet," he said. "Not until it's completely neutralized." The Deathworlder's eyes flashed one last time, filled with a fury that would never fully die. It was clear that this was a battle they had won, but the war, the hunt, was far from over. The final stand. The Deathworlder was immobilized, its massive body trembling in the net, but it wasn't defeated. Zarkin knew that. It was a predator, resilient and determined, and if they weren't careful, it could find a way to break free. The hunters circled the creature cautiously, weapons raised, their eyes scanning every movement, every twitch of the beast's muscles. The Deathworlder's growls were deep and guttural, its eyes blazing with fury, and yet the thrill of the hunt seemed to have dissipated. It was no longer playing. It was desperate, and desperation made it dangerous. We can't let it escape, Lyra said, her voice low and steady as she kept her weapon aimed at the creature's head. The blood from her previous injury had dried on her arm, but the pain didn't show in her eyes. She was focused. Zarkan nodded, his own eyes never leaving the Deathworlder. We finish it now. No more games. Kale and the others were tense, their breathing shallow as they waited for Zarkan's signal. The Deathworlder's body was twisted at an unnatural angle, its claws clawing against the ground, trying to push itself free from the restraints, but it was losing strength. Its roars were becoming weaker, and its massive form seemed to shrink, slowly yielding to the relentless pressure of the trap. Zarkan stepped forward, cautiously, not wanting to give the creature a chance to surprise him. His hands tightened around his weapon. He had to do this carefully. If they attacked too soon, it might only get more dangerous. If they attacked too late, they'd risk everything. This is it, Zarkan muttered to himself. We need to make sure it doesn't get another chance to hunt. The creature's eyes flicked to him, its focus sharp and calculating. And for a moment, Zarkan saw something he hadn't seen before, a flicker of recognition. The Deathworlder wasn't just an animal. It was intelligent, capable of understanding the threat in front of it. But that moment passed in an instant, and the creature let out a furious, final roar, throwing itself forward with a force that sent shockwaves through the ground. The net snapped under the force of its movement, but it was too late. The hunters reacted in unison, opening fire on the creature's vital spots. Kale aimed for its head, Lyra for its underbelly, and Zarkan, knowing that a direct hit to its chest would do the most damage, fired at the creature's core. The blast hit, and the Deathworlder's roar turned into a shriek of pain. For a moment, everything went still. The forest was silent, save for the soft crackling of the energy pulses that had connected with the creature's body. The Deathworlder's massive form collapsed to the ground, its body twitching once before it lay still. The fierce glow in its eyes dimmed, and the fight drained from it like air from a punctured balloon. Zarkan stepped forward cautiously, keeping his weapon raised. They weren't out of danger yet. The creature might be down, but it wasn't completely out of the fight. Kale and Lyra moved to join him, their expressions grim but relieved. We did it, Lyra said, her voice quieter now. We actually did it. Zarkan didn't lower his weapon, not just yet. He knew better than to let his guard down so soon. It's not over until we're sure it's done. They approached the creature's body, stepping carefully around its massive form. Its breathing was slow and labored, and there was an unsettling stillness about it now, its massive claws twitching one last time before going still. I think we can call it, Kale said, finally lowering his weapon and giving a sigh of relief. It's finished. Zarkan's hand trembled slightly as he lowered his own weapon, but his mind was still working, processing what had just happened. The fight had been brutal, harder than anything they'd expected, but they had won. They had faced something truly terrifying, something unlike any threat they'd ever encountered, and they had survived. But something still gnawed at the back of Zarkan's mind. The Deathworlder had been more than just a creature. It had been a test, a challenge, one they hadn't been fully prepared for. And while they had won this battle, Zarkan couldn't shake the feeling that there would be more. Let's move, Zarkan said, his voice steady. We need to get back to the ship. I got a feeling we're not done with this planet just yet. The group nodded, their exhaustion evident but tempered by the relief of survival. They had come to this world to hunt the deadliest creatures in the galaxy, but what they had encountered here was something far worse than any predator. It was a test, one that had been designed to break them, to push them beyond their limits. And they had survived. But Zarkan couldn't shake the sense that this victory had come at a cost. They had defeated the Deathworlder, but the real battle had only just begun. The universe was full of dangers, and this planet was no exception. Something told him that what they had faced was just the beginning of something far darker, and the only way to survive was to keep moving forward. As they made their way back through the forest, Zarkan's thoughts turned to the future. There would be more challenges ahead, but this time, they would be ready. And if the galaxy had any doubts about the strength of the human spirit, it would soon learn just how wrong it was. The aftermath. The journey back to the ship was quieter than Zarkin had expected. The victory over the Deathworlder had left a sense of finality in the air, but it also felt like a door closing on something larger, something he couldn't quite grasp. The forest, now bathed in the soft glow of the dying sun, seemed to hold its breath as they moved through it. Kale led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the trees. Lyra, though exhausted, was alert, her weapon still in hand, ready to defend herself if anything unexpected happened. Zarkin walked behind them, his thoughts preoccupied, his mind still replaying the last few moments with the Deathworlder. Was it really over, or had they just survived the first round of a far more dangerous game? They had destroyed the creature, but there was something in the way it had fought, something primal and calculated. Zarkin had been in enough battles to know when he was up against an opponent that had more to it than just raw power. That Deathworlder had been more than just a beast. It had been a force of nature. And yet, it had been driven by something darker. A predator, not just in body, but in mind. Zarkin shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. For now, they had to focus on getting back to the ship and reporting their success. At least, that's what he told himself. The clearing came into view, and Zarkin saw the ship in the distance, its massive hull silhouetted against the darkening sky. They were so close now. Relief washed over him for the first time in what felt like hours. But just as he allowed himself to feel the weight of that relief, a sound shattered the stillness, the low hum of engines. Zarkin's heart skipped a beat. His eyes snapped to the sky. The ship had landed, but the sound he heard was wrong. It wasn't the soft hum of their own engines. This was something more distinct, more ominous. "What the hell is that?" Kale asked, his voice sharp, filled with concern. Zarkin didn't answer right away. His mind raced, trying to process the situation. The hum grew louder, more intense, and the shadows around them seemed to shift. Then, through the trees, he saw them. Figures emerging from the fog of twilight. A group of them. The new arrivals weren't human. They were taller, their bodies shifting in a way that felt unnatural. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, casting an eerie reflection across the landscape. The alien figures didn't approach immediately. Instead, they stopped at the edge of the forest, observing the group of hunters with a sort of cold detachment. Their presence sent a chill through Zarkin, and his grip on his weapon tightened instinctively. "They must have been waiting for us," Zarkin muttered, recognizing the style of the armor they wore. The black exoskeletons marked them as a military group, but they weren't just any soldiers. They were part of an elite alien faction known for their ruthless efficiency in hunting down Deathworlders. "We need to move," Lyra whispered, her voice laced with fear. "They're not here to chat." Zarkin glanced at his team, their faces tense, but determined. There was no time to argue. The Deathworlder might have been defeated, but it seemed their real problem was just beginning. "What do they want?" Kale asked, his voice urgent. Zarkin took a deep breath. He knew the answer even before he said it. "They've been watching us. They saw us fight the Deathworlder. And they've decided that we're the next target." A moment of stunned silence passed before Lyra spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're here for the humans." Zarkin nodded slowly, the weight of the situation sinking in. The galaxy had underestimated humanity. They had thought humans were weak, easily overpowered, or no match for the deadliest of threats. But after witnessing the hunters struggle against the Deathworlder, the aliens had realized their mistake. The Deathworlder was just the beginning, a test to see how strong these humans truly were. And now, they were marked. "You're right," Zarkin replied. "And they'll stop at nothing to take us down. But they made a big mistake." Kale raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "They thought they were the hunters," Zarkin said, his voice cold and steady. But they'll soon learn. We're the ones being hunted. A wave of anger swept over the group. These aliens thought they could intimidate humanity, test their strength, and walk away unscathed. But Zarkin knew the truth. Humans had always thrived under pressure. They had always fought back, harder than anyone expected. And these aliens, no matter how advanced, were about to find that out the hard way. "Get ready," Zarkin ordered, his eyes never leaving the aliens. "It's not over. This is just the beginning." The group moved into position, forming a line of defense. Their weapons were raised, but Zarkin knew this wasn't going to be an easy fight. The aliens weren't going to just roll over. They would fight with everything they had. But the hunters weren't backing down either. The night was growing darker, the air thick with tension. The silence that had filled the forest was now replaced by a low, buzzing hum, an ominous sound that only confirmed one thing. The galaxy would soon learn that when humans said, "Something feels off," they weren't just being paranoid. They were warning everyone. And it was a warning that would shake the galaxy to its core. The game had changed. And now, the real fight for survival was about to begin.